Hi everyone. I wanted to let you know beforehand that the following episode will contain subject matter depicting criminal and violent activity that may be triggering to listeners. This will be one of the heavier topics discussed on this podcast, but in my opinion, also one of the most important. Thank you for listening. On December 13th, 2001, Portland resident 14-year-old Melissa Bittler was raped and murdered in the backyard of a neighbor while on her way to school. It was a horrific and tragic act, and it could have been prevented. In 1997, 3 Portland teenagers were sexually assaulted in a 9-month span, all by the man who would one day go on to kill Bittler. None of the survivors knew each other or of each other's attacks. However, their cases could have been linked. Following a sexual assault, materials including blood, hair, and clothes are collected and stored in a sexual assault forensic evidence kit, otherwise known as a safe kit. In theory, these kits should be sent to a lab for analysis, which can then link cases through DNA matches. However, in this instance, evidence from all 3 cases was placed in a stockpile of untested kits, a storage unit essentially, and left there, just adding to a growing safe kit backlog. This backlog, which had grown to over 1,000 untested kits, would be made public in early 2002, just months after Melissa Bittler was murdered. When news broke that this violent killing of a teenage girl could have been avoided, police officials promised they would improve on this issue. However, by 2015, Portland now had a total of 2,408 untested kits, nearly half of Oregon's backlog, which by then had grown to over 5,000. Today, that backlog doesn't exist. Since October 2018, Oregon has maintained a backlog of exactly 0. While the state has come a long way, this is not an isolated problem. As of June 2021, in the US, only 8 states, as well as the District of Columbia, have managed to clear their backlogs. This topic is actually one that I collaborated on with 2 classmates in college back in 2019. At that point, Oregon was only one of 3 states with a cleared backlog. The progress is encouraging, but the country still has a long way to go. In this episode, I wanted to take a look at the history of safe kits, the issues that result in untested kits, and the steps that can be made to clear backlogs nationwide. In order to even have the issue of a safe kit backlog, you have to have a widespread distribution of them, which, in the early 70s, was far from a reality. Among the individuals most passionate about tackling this issue at the time was Martha Goddard. Known by her peers as Marty, Goddard was volunteering at a crisis hotline for teenagers located in a Chicago townhouse. In hearing the stories of so many young women and children, she realized many were fleeing situations involving sexual abuse, often dealing with people they knew, which greatly contrasted the time and place's idea that the majority of assaults were committed by strangers in the night, basically the stereotypical stalker lurking in the shadows. And while these situations happen, we now know there's a much higher chance the survivor knows their abuser, but at the time, this was eye-opening. More often than not, it seemed that these abusers were walking free, without any repercussions. This led Goddard to 2 big questions. Why were so many predators getting away with their crimes? And what would it take to stop them? Lacking large amounts of personal funding, she associated herself with Ray Wiebolt Jr., an heir to a department store fortune who had used the family's wealth to run a progressive-minded charity foundation. Quickly becoming an executive in the organization, she now had access to resources she had never had. She made the most of her opportunity. She began looking into every step law enforcement and medical professionals took following the processing of a survivor of sexual assault, with the intent of identifying the points in each case that failed to lead to an arrest. One of the immediately noticeable issues came in the transferring of a survivor from the police officers to hospital workers. Individuals would often be dropped off in the ER by a police officer, alone, and told to wait there, while the officer notified a health professional, then left. When survivors were seen by nurses, they would regularly be cleaned and have their clothes removed and thrown away, immediately destroying large amounts of potential evidence. Even in cases when clothing samples were collected, they were often banded together and bagged up for storage space, completely tainting anything they had saved. Although crime lab DNA testing was still years away, things like blood spatter, glass shards, fingerprints, and fibers could still be processed at a much more cautious degree. Other problems were less tangible for Goddard to address. The most important, arguably, being the fact that it still seemed that following an assault, police procedures were designed to make sure the survivor was not lying, rather than collecting evidence to find their attacker. This mentality, at an official, government-sanctioned level, can be traced back to 19th century rape exams, where they were done largely to test the honesty and virtue of a woman. In this instance, I say woman because at the time, the idea of a man being raped was far from comprehensible to many, and these procedures were specifically designed, well, they would say to exam, I think a better term would be to interrogate, women who were survivors of an assault. It was in the 19th century, but unfortunately, the quote-unquote victim-blaming mentality was still very mainstream. Goddard knew this was not going to change overnight, which drove her to delve deeper into the issues of sexual assault evidence. Because if she could create a uniform way to properly collect evidence upon every reported sexual assault, she wouldn't need people to believe a survivor's spoken account, or make a survivor have to repeatedly defend their claims, as they would now be in possession of irrefutable evidence no one could deny. Even with funding from the Weebot Foundation, Goddard knew she needed government funding and approval if there was any chance of creating a uniformed, consistent way of treating and examining a survivor of sexual assault. At the time, she was working with the group Chicago Legal Action for Women, CLAW for short. The group, fed up with government inaction and wanting to make an impactful statement that would get people's attention, made the decision to unexpectedly march into the office of State Attorney Bernard Carey, putting up messages on the wall such as "Wanted, Bernard Carey for aiding and abetting rapists." The efforts of CLAW were a success. Carey assigned Goddard as one of the leaders on the area's Citizens Advisory Panel on Rape. In this position, Goddard and the panel quickly identified two goals: investigate failures in policing and suggest sweeping reforms. She had already begun the first part of this process, having spent time studying the experiences of survivors upon arrival at the hospital, and also the mishandling of evidence. While the police blamed the hospitals, and this seemed like a medical issue, she realized the nurses had received no training by law enforcement on the correct ways to conduct an examination. Nurses, in general, would attempt to take care of a survivor the best way they knew, but as I mentioned, that could often mean immediately showering them and attempting to avoid any invasive actions that could further traumatize a survivor. For the most part, it seems nurses were trying to help their patient, but they just didn't know the right way to do it. There was no one specific method taught, no uniform checklist to go through. If something like this existed, Goddard felt it would be much easier to accurately care for a survivor as well as properly process any evidence. By now, she had established a working relationship with police officer Rudy Nimox, an officer who handled incest cases and had seen firsthand that many survivors did in fact know their attacker. In bringing her ideas to him, he said she should talk to Louis Vitullo, a police sergeant who would become Chicago's chief microanalyst in the city's crime lab. However, according to multiple sources, Nimox also gave Goddard a warning. Take care. Try not to confront or challenge the men in the crime lab directly. It was a peculiar message, but one Goddard would soon understand. At the meeting, Goddard presented Vitullo with her ideas, including several of the methods and tools that should be involved in examining a patient. According to Cynthia Gary, a collaborator and friend of Goddard's, she left disappointed and somewhat shocked, as Vitullo allegedly screamed at her and told her she was wasting his time. I should be clear to note that this is taken from oral interviews and not necessarily written record, but still, according to multiple sources, it seems clear Goddard left confused at the antagonism she had received. Even more confusing was, just a little while later, Goddard received a call. It was Vitullo, and he had something to show her. To her surprise, upon arriving at his office, Vitullo presented her with a cardboard kit. In it was a collection of numerous utensils she had discussed with him. Stranger yet, he'd labeled it the Vitullo Evidence Collection Kit. Strange as it was, Goddard did not object to the name, at least publicly. However, behind closed doors, friends say she lamented the fact that he had given himself credit over something he initially scolded her for even presenting him with. Some believe she knew the kit would be more widely well received if it did seem like it was invented by a man, so for the good of the project as a whole, she kept quiet. We will never know the full story in its entirety, but it should be noted that, upon Vitullo's passing in 2006, many sources credited him for inventing the first standardized rape kit, with Goddard's name being left out of any obituary of his I stumbled upon. As much as the lack of credit may have bothered Goddard, it did not stop her from continuing to fight for the kit's widespread implementation. It's at this time when she received funding from a somewhat unexpected source. Playboy magazine was in its heyday, and during the 70s was actually donating quite a bit of money to women's liberation movement causes, both through Playboy Foundation and in providing funding that was instrumental in the creation of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, which, fun fact, was actually co-founded by a then little-known lawyer named Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Hefner is a complicated character in history. Much of his push for women's liberation is directly related to his own desire to free men of the taboo and shame connected to erotica and men's guilt in this department as a whole. And I think it could be argued that he and the leaders of Playboy were incentivized to support these causes in hopes to avoid furthering the publication's already constant backlash from a number of people. Whatever the case, in this instance, Goddard was not reaching out blindly. She had a friend on the inside, Margaret Pokorny. Pokorny had been involved in a number of women's liberation causes by this point and now worked for the Playboy Foundation. She was in charge of finding ways to creatively effect change beyond funding, which was not always plentiful. Fortunately for Goddard, she applied for a Playboy Foundation grant and was accepted, receiving $10,000 to put towards starting a rape kit system. In this situation, it was honestly a perfect match because Goddard now had more funding for her project than ever before, and with the help of Pokorny, was able to get even more out of this pairing than simply funding. For instance, Pokorny was able to get Playboy designers to help in creating the kits' packaging, and when it came time to assemble them, was able to gather a team of local retired women who volunteered to help put the kits together in the Playboy offices, powered by unlimited free coffee. In 1978, after years and years of efforts, Goddard delivered the first of its kind standardized rape kit to 25 hospitals in the Chicago area. In a short period of time, the kits were already helping solve cases and convict sexual offenders. Rudy Nimox, the police officer Goddard had to work with, had recently been appointed to the head of the sex homicide department and saw in person Goddard's prediction. The uniform kits acted as irrefutable proof a juror could understand and trust, and it affected the outcome of numerous cases. After this, the person who had arguably been the most important in realizing this goal went somewhat MIA. Goddard drifted out of the spotlight and into obscurity. She'd always been a bit of her own, even at the crisis hotline she worked at. While the women there had the same goal, her suits and neat look contrasted with the more hippie-esque vibe a lot of her peers embodied, so it wasn't unlike her to be on her own, but according to Pokorny, there was much more to her absence. In the late 70s, Goddard took a trip to Hawaii, and in Pokorny's words, came back a different person. Eventually, Goddard confided in her that she had been abducted, held at knife point, and raped while on her vacation. After this horrific experience, it seems she stepped back from any form of attention altogether. And, while this kept her from being the face of the cause, she continued to work in the background, traveling throughout Illinois, staying at whatever cheap motels she could, given her lack of funding, and kept pushing for the kits to be implemented in every county across the state. Her colleagues note that she, as a white woman, was driven to fight safe kits from being distributed and used for white survivors disproportionately. At one point in the early 80s, she told an Illinois State Legislative Committee that the lack of services on the south and west side of Chicago, where a majority of our black victims reside, was totally disgraceful. I don't mean to put her on too high of a pedestal for this alone, as several women of color were fighting for the same causes at this time and very aware of the racial disparities involving cases of sexual assault. However, I think that it is worth mentioning that while there are still several issues in the disparity in the effectiveness of a safe kit in the case, depending on a survivor's race, she was aware of this and pushing against it 40 years ago. This episode is going to go much beyond Goddard's story, but I start with focusing on her so much because I think it's important to acknowledge that someone who was so instrumental in the creation of uniform safe kits was forever changed because of a lack of their widespread implementation. An assault of any kind is absolutely horrific, but the added knowledge that the work she had put her entire life into had not yet reached Hawaii had to be incredibly difficult. While I want to be careful and try not to assume too much, I would imagine that her first-hand experience in witnessing the ways these cases were handled may have kept her from reporting the assault to local authorities, as she knew how low of a chance she had at seeing her own case solved. Even after all of this, Goddard arguably played an integral role in not just starting the concept of implementing the uniform safe kit, but in seeing their usage spread nationwide. In the 80s, as she was continuing to travel Illinois and the country as a whole, she attended an FBI conference discussing how to find rapists and serial killers across state lines, but was disheartened by the way they seemed to show little empathy for victims, spending large portions of the conference showing pictures of mutilated female bodies and faces that were overtly identifiable. Horrified, she talked to the organizers, explained to them her knowledge and expertise in this field, and, on that very day, winging it, gave a presentation about her Chicago work, explaining how the rape kit system worked. After, she said in a later interview, two guys from the Department of Justice just approached her and asked her to replicate the program nationwide. She agreed, but basically, from the start, experienced a constant belittlement, regularly hearing, "Are you a cop? Are you a lawyer?" at places she'd be asked to present. Despite her basically unmatched knowledge of this issue, she lacked the credentials certain people felt she needed. By the 90s, she had turned into somewhat of a recluse. While she passed away in 2015 at the age of 74, a nephew of hers said she struggled with substance abuse for much of her later years and, in what he believes to be the result of intense paranoia, alienated most of her friends and family. Documents from the end of her life indicate she actually eventually attempted to pursue a degree in forensics at a local community college, which, again, she's not around, so I don't want to attempt to read into or speak too much about her psyche, but this makes me sad. To think such an incredibly intelligent human being, who had done more good than most ever will, felt underqualified or undereducated to the point that she needed to seek a degree, just doesn't seem right. Goddard deserves to be in the history books far more than she currently is, but given interviews I've read and anecdotes acquaintances and friends gave, she was much more concerned in the cause seeing widespread attention than herself. Because while she may have been one of the most important people in implementing standardized safe kits, she wasn't the only one. Dozens were fighting for these causes, and in a number of ways. Take Rose Brady, who, in 1977, at the age of 18, joined the Baltimore City Police, beginning a career that would be part of revolutionizing the usage of safe kits in her area. At the time she began her career, few women, especially this young, were doing this kind of work. From the start, she excelled. Her first undercover job led to the arrest of a pimp operating out of massage parlors. She dedicated her career predominantly to stopping predators of all kinds. Early on, however, she noticed not everyone in the force shared the same drive. One of her rookie assignments was the monotonous task of transporting Special Victims Unit evidence from the various precincts to the Baltimore County Police Evidence Room. However, much of that evidence was quickly destroyed, as the sergeant who ran the room was, as Brady puts it, a dictator, who demanded the destruction of any materials that had not quickly led to an arrest. Even back in the 70s and 80s, Brady had never witnessed such a callous mindset regarding homicide evidence. This was specific to a unit that predominantly handled crimes involving sexual assault. Now, this isn't the end of Brady's story, but to complete hers, I have to introduce a new character, Dr. Rudiger Breitnecker. In the 70s, Breitnecker was working as a forensic pathologist at the Greater Baltimore Medical Center and as a courtroom forensic expert. He excelled at both fields. He was frequently flown all around to be put on the stand, where numerous people said he was one of the best in the country. A brilliant person with the ability to break down the complexities of forensic science in a comprehensible way that made the jury feel that they weren't being talked down to, but rather educated. By all accounts, his only bias in a court of law was towards the science. I was unable to find anything suggesting he had any alternate motives in being one of the most sought-out court experts. But that was only really a sparsely occurring part-time job. His main profession and true passion was his work in the hospital, specifically with sexual assault survivors. He actually opened the first rape care center at his hospital, training medical professionals how to conduct respectful yet meticulous exams before uniform safe kits had reached Baltimore or even Chicago. Once exams were complete, he would study the evidence. Despite DNA evidence lacking its current efficacy, he could check for any sexually transmitted diseases or infections, and through checking for elevated acid phosphatase levels, determine if recent intercourse had occurred. Then, he would take the evidence, make sure it was properly labeled, and, depending on the material, store them in either a freezer or a room temperature cabinet. At the time, no one else was really doing anything of this kind. For most, it seemed to be pointless. But Breitnecker was ahead of his time, seemingly creating one of the first DNA databases in the country, thinking that one day, it could be useful. He would be proven correct in 1984, when British researcher Sir Alec Jeffreys discovered a way to link DNA from a crime scene to a specific individual. Fingerprinting technology followed soon after. Almost immediately, some of the evidence in Breitnecker's database underwent testing, but very few of these led to an arrest, and not all of them were being tested. Because it was so new, DNA technology was very expensive and took a long time. The FBI's DNA database had yet to be created, so there was further complications in connecting evidence to an individual. By 1997, very little of Breitnecker's database of over 2,200 cases had been tested, but at the age of 67, he was ready to retire. At the time of his retirement, the hospital was still practicing his method of sexual assault exams, but without his presence, adopted the SafeKit system, which had been continuing to spread across the country since the 70s. The following year actually marked the first time that all 50 states could link DNA profiles to the FBI database, which, while still new and a work in progress, was the best way to connect evidence with other cases. Known as the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, it is this system that would allow the work of people like Marty Goddard and Dr. Breitnecker to have the greatest impact. As we now know, if someone commits an assault, it is rare for this to be a one-time act. And now, there's actually a way to track a person's criminal DNA record. While CODIS operated in a systematic, uniformed manner, it is humans who are in charge of processing that evidence. And this is how the issue of chronic SafeKit backlogs has come to plague the United States. Currently, it is estimated there are hundreds of thousands of untested kits across the country. While an exact number is difficult to come to due to the sheer amount of data, as well as the fact that an assault occurs in the US nearly once a minute, it is an undeniably immense problem. In Baltimore, back in 2004, Rose Brady was starting to understand just how serious of an issue this was becoming. By this point, after nearly 3 decades in the service, she had worked her way up to the head of the Baltimore County Police Department's Special Victims Unit, becoming the first woman to ever do so. Throughout her career, she had worked in a number of departments, but had actually spent the last while in homicide. Just as it had been a problem 27 years prior, she was struggling to deal with the sheer lack of evidence for SVU. She shared this with a friend, who had actually become the supervisor in the pathology department at the Greater Baltimore Medical Center, which was still the main place survivors were sent in the area. Her friend asked if she would be interested in Dr. Breitnecker's slides. Brady had one important question. Who was Dr. Breitnecker? As she learned more about the doctor, Brady was floored. Number one, that she had never known of this, and number two, realizing how little of his storage of evidence had been used in criminal cases. With the clear message that absolutely no more of Breitnecker's slates were to be destroyed, she gathered a small, dedicated team of just 6 individuals and got working. Over the next 10 years, through testing Breitnecker's evidence, while also subpoenaing a number of untested safe kits remaining in police storage, the team led police to developing 101 DNA profiles, of which 84 generated a hit in CODIS. The team was succeeding in their goal, but this only further highlighted the awful reality that, in cases ranging from 1978 to 2004, evidence that could have led to an arrest had just been sitting around. According to Brady and her team, one of the most difficult aspects of the entire project was contacting and notifying survivors that their case could be solved, as this process can re-traumatize individuals. Often the further cases go, the further a survivor will face triggering situations throughout the process. In efforts to provide survivors with some support, detectives started leaving them with brochures containing psychologist contact info, which may not seem like much, but was a big step for the way many handle these cases and the individuals affected. Eventually, a total of 62 arrests and 49 convictions were made, according to arrest records and court files obtained by ProPublica. The story of both Dr. Breitnecker's and Sergeant Rose Brady's careers represent an issue that was affecting the entire country. At this time in history, in the mid-2000s, while safe kits were being used in all 50 states, not one had an entirely cleared backlog. The issue was certainly not being talked about as much as it should, but advocates were able to get the attention of the federal government, and on October 30th, 2004, President Bush signed into law the Justice for All Act. Its main goals were to eliminate the growing nationwide backlog of DNA evidence while also improving and expanding DNA testing at the federal, state, and local level. A decade later, not a single state had cleared their backlog. However, by 2019, 3 states, Ohio, Kentucky, and Oregon, had managed to get it done. It was at this time that I was first learning about this issue. I was a senior in college, taking a solutions journalism class with a focus on the Me Too movement. Solutions journalism is an approach to reporting that focuses on social issues and the ways people respond to them. Its goal is to use credible evidence to show why and how certain responses are working or not working. Often, I think people can feel like the news is just presenting them with all the horrors of the world and none of the answers. Solutions journalism attempts to give readers an understanding of the potential solutions. This practice is somewhat new and deals with plenty of criticism. Some believe this can lead to feel-good stories that lack the reality of true, cold hard news. Others feel it can easily turn into advocacy journalism, filled with biases. It is true that in solutions journalism, there is the fact that in any story, you are likely not going to be able to touch on every single potential solution to the problem being discussed. But in the same way that's true, isn't every news outlet biased by nature in the fact that it's choosing what news to give you? If run by an earnest team, hopefully, their goal will generally be to give you what they feel will be the most important to the most amount of people. Obviously, there are times when the statement isn't necessarily true, niche outlets and whatnot, but the point is, even with the world's most honest, dedicated news team, there are going to be stories that aren't told. So in the same way something like a local TV news station aims to give the community the most need-to-know info, an honest, dedicated solutions reporter will highlight the most important potential solutions while also being honest about their limitations. With this approach framing the class, 2 of my classmates and I chose to focus on the issue of untested safe kits. At the time, Oregon had only recently cleared their backlog, and, considering we were attending the University of Oregon, we knew that we could have access to numerous people who were involved in ending the backlog, and felt that learning how Oregon managed to complete this goal could help us better examine why the issue still remained prevalent across the country. 2 years later, I wanted to take another look at this topic because, although Oregon had cleared its backlog by the time we completed our piece, the state was still dealing with pressing issues that had yet to be solved. I mentioned it earlier, but between 2019 and now, only 5 more states have cleared their backlogs. Some of the first to do so are even dealing with problems that didn't exist a couple years back. While I will continue to touch on a number of parts of the country, I wanted to once again focus on Oregon and break down exactly how the state got to where it is today. Back in 2016, over a decade after Melissa Bittler had been murdered, Oregon was still trying to grapple with an issue that had been gaining increasingly negative attention both in the state and nationwide. Although the backlog had not received the attention it deserved, there were 2 people who had been pushing for government action for almost a decade and a half: Melissa's parents. Obviously, the pain of losing their child was absolutely devastating, but the aftermath and knowledge that the murderer could have been in custody at the time she was killed had to be crushing. Then, to see nothing get done year after year, I just can't imagine the frustration. With the internet connecting the world far more than it did in 2001, the Bittlers started a petition on change.org to end Oregon's backlog. Part of their petition reads, quote, "We expect police to test rape kits in a timely and efficient manner, but this is not the case. In July of 2002, we were assured by law enforcement that the backlogs of rape kits would be processed. Now, in 2016, there are twice as many backlogged. We're calling on the Oregon House to pass Melissa's bill, which will require police to pick up rape kits within 7 days of a hospital alerting them and submit the kit for testing within 14 days of their receipt." End quote. Their page was signed by nearly 6,000 individuals as the issue continued to gain attention as people looked to see what Oregon politicians would do. They wouldn't have to wait long. On March 28, 2016, Governor Kate Brown signed Senate Bill 1571, also known as Melissa's Law, which had passed through the legislature unanimously. It was a victory, but for the Bittlers, it was a victory after a series of never-ending disappointments. For years, they had been working with the state to push funding to end the backlog with little success. However, there would be a few crucial victories in the lead-up to the passing of Melissa's Law. In late 2014, Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus R. Vance Jr. announced that his office would be allocating $38 million of obtained asset forfeiture funds to distribute to places nationwide looking to improve upon their backlog. The following year, Oregon was granted a portion of this funding. Shortly thereafter, the Federal Bureau of Justice Assistance announced the city of Portland would be receiving a $2 million grant, given roughly half of all the state's untested kits came from the city. When Melissa's Law was passed, these, along with state-allocated funds, provided Oregon with the resources to take the bill's words and turn them into action. The bill, as Melissa's parents called for in their petition, required safe kits to be picked up by police within 7 days of being notified by a hospital, and then, once in police's custody, required the kit to be submitted to testing within 14 days. This was huge because a previous lack of accountability allowed the backlog to grow. As far as I know from the research I did, no state, including Oregon, was still dealing with the contamination issues of the 70s. Exams were being done appropriately, but the following steps, getting the kit from the hospital to police and eventually to testing. That's where it was easy for kids to get lost in the backlog. Melissa's law also required police to store all safe kits for 60 years because, as was the case in Baltimore in the early 2000s, often SVU evidence was being thrown out if it didn't lead to a quick arrest. A link to the entirety of Melissa's law will be in the description if you would like to read the full thing. Almost immediately after its signing, police began testing backlogged kits. They started tracking the time it took to test individual safe kits upon arriving in the lab. The law had required timely delivery of the kit to a lab, but no deadline once in the hands of forensics. They discovered that, in 2017, testing was actually at an all-time slow, according to Captain Alex Gardner, Director of Forensic Services. This was because, while Melissa's law had provided police with funds to hire 9 new full-time forensic analysts, the process of hiring and providing in-house training can take up to 18 months, which, with an already limited staff, slowed testing considerably. During this time, it took about 4 weeks to get a kit through testing. By 2020, according to the Department of State Police's annual forensics report, analyst turnaround time was estimated at 13 days, well within their goal of 30 days. Total turnaround time, meaning the total time since the exam was conducted until the completion of the kit's forensic exam, reached a high in 2017 of 123 days, but had dropped to 87 by 2019. The COVID pandemic drastically affected testing capacity. In December of 2020, police were in possession of 279 pending kits, not backlog yet due to when they were sent in, but still untested. While testing rates weren't what police had initially predicted, they hope to be back to normal rates soon. In 2019, while working on this project, I spoke with Oregon State Police spokesperson Captain Tim Fox, who, when asked about keeping up to date with the forensic testing, said it was near impossible, likening it to whack-a-mole. The state's forensic unit is not divided by the type of DNA tested, meaning analysts could be working with safe kits one day and property crimes the next. So, if efforts are put into one form of testing, others can be left behind. Melissa's law rightly focused on ending the state's safe kit backlog, but this doesn't mean that the rate of processing other kinds of forensic evidence slows down. Captain Fox readily admitted it was not a perfect system, telling me that, in a perfect world, where they could have at least 20 scientists working 52 weeks a year, they'd be good. But it's unlikely that we'll see anything of that case anytime soon. So, it's clear to see why, without stringent regulation, other states' forensic units get overwhelmed and their backlogs continue to grow. Following the passing of Melissa's law, a task force was assembled to continue working to improve the collection and processing of safe kits. Comprised of a number of individuals, including survivors of sexual assault, a nurse, a forensic examiner, as well as a number of government and police officials, one of their main goals was to make the whole system a more survivor-driven process. In 2019, I spoke to a sexual assault nurse examiner, otherwise known as a SANE nurse, who asked I use her first name, Nicole. She reiterated the task force goal, telling me the process should be driven by the patient. She said constantly checking in and communicating with her patients is key. Because these exams can be incredibly invasive, she says it's important to make sure that they understand why each step needs to be done. She also makes it clear that the survivor can choose which parts of the exam they feel comfortable participating in and have the option of leaving at any point. In Eugene, where I worked on this project in college, anytime a survivor comes to the hospital for a safe kit examination, the group Sexual Assault Support Services, SAS for short, dispatch someone to the hospital. SAS is funded through the city and state and provides free support to survivors of sexual assault, harassment, and gender violence. One of the individuals I collaborated with spoke to Bianca Marino, an Engaging Allies coordinator at the SAS office in Eugene. Marino is clear that it is not her job to help conduct the exam, but rather assist the survivor in any way they need. Because interviews can be one of the most re-traumatizing experiences for survivors, having someone by their side can be helpful. Bianca says one of her most important jobs is making sure the survivor knows all their options, as many come to the hospital believing that they have to file a police report, or that the safe kit will 100% lead to an arrest. As Marino says, a safe kit will never prove a sexual assault. It can't prove lack of consent. All too often, survivors go to court only to lose the case and be more traumatized. Her goal is certainly not to deter anyone from filing a case, just to help them understand all of their options. Not every city in the state has something like SAS, and I think a more widespread implementation of something like this could help better a survivor's experience as soon as they arrive at a hospital. One of the main goals of the task force was to provide permanent funding to keep the backlog non-existent. Because while federal grants had helped clear the backlog, those were one-time payments, and in 2019, there was still no permanent funding allocated to safe kit testing. Recently, I reached out to Captain Fox again to see where the state now stood on this issue. As of June 2021, there is still no permanent funding, as the labs are, as Captain Fox wrote to me, quote, funded through the general fund and adopted through the legislature during the long session, end quote. So, essentially the forensic labs have been able to get enough funding to maintain a cleared backlog year after year, but the state technically does not have a plan implemented to make sure the funding never goes away. Hopefully, that funding won't vanish, but in a department that is already overworked and underfunded, it's tricky. Safe kits cost well over $1,000 to test, and sometimes it can be hard to see results. Even after Oregon tested the over 5,000 safe kits in storage, these efforts only led to a handful of arrests. As Bianca Marino said, safe kits can't prove consent. In some situations, the statute of limitations had expired in cases, so certain cases weren't eligible for legal action even after being tested. While this is true, the importance of having all kits tested and put into CODIS is crucial, as each DNA sample creates a better chance in connecting seemingly unrelated cases across the country. For example, in 2020 alone, Oregon testing resulted in 652 safe kit hits generated, while 377 safe kit DNA profiles were entered into CODIS, information that could one day, or may have already, led to an arrest. A goal of the task force that has had great success is the effort to create an online accessible safe kit tracking system for survivors. The Sexual Assault Kit Management System Tracking Program, or SAMSTRAC, was launched in early 2020, and according to the state's annual forensic legislative report, deployment was completed on December 31st of that year. This system provides survivors with a business card containing their kit number and instructions for accessing their kit's information digitally and anonymously. In the past, it could be quite difficult for survivors to receive information on their case, and the processing of requesting files and contacting authorities can be quite traumatic. So the ability for them to do it on their own, without anyone else's knowledge, is a crucial advancement in a survivor's autonomy and power following an assault. Several states have adopted some form of a survivor tracking system, and it should continue to spread in the coming years. The progression of how medical professionals, law enforcement, and government officials handle cases of sexual assault has never been seamless, and continues to have problems. Kentucky, one of the first states to clear their backlog, was still taking roughly 200 days to test a kit at the start of 2020, far from the legislature-imposed benchmark of 60 days they were supposed to reach by that summer. Others who have a cleared backlog may not necessarily have a tracking system for survivors, and vice versa. With 42 states still in possession of backlog kits, I imagine this will be an issue our country continues to deal with for some time. But that period of time shouldn't drag on. The Bittlers had to struggle and keep fighting for nearly 15 years, until a combination of persistence and the introduction of new technology allowed them to connect and share their story with more people than ever before. Stories like their Change.org petition having a direct impact on the passing of Melissa's Law are clear signs to me that social media and online engagement can be used for good. There are absolutely people in each state with a backlog, fighting to end it. They just might not have the platform they need. For the United States to reach a backlog of 0, the good it would do, as well as the statement it would make about how our country views and handles the issue of sexual assault, would have immense impact. It won't happen overnight, but soon, hopefully, this will be an issue in our nation's rear view. Fickle Future is written, edited, and produced by me, Ruben Estrada. Music by Hobby Beats. You can find all of his work on linktree/hobbybeats. The URL is located in the episode's description. Cover art by Alora Batson. As always, thank you for listening.